Mage Tower Master, Oscar Sage, knelt on the blood-soaked ground, a sword embedded deep in his abdomen, his life slipping away. Yet, even at death's doorstep, his only concern was whether any others had survived. The White Tower Mage, upon learning that the High Priest had declared war, had rallied his people and marched into battle. But they were met with devastation. The High Priest and his demonic army struck with terrifying force, aiming to collapse humanity itself. Nearly all of them were slaughtered. Still, they fought valiantly. In the end, it was the High Priest who personally drove the blade into Oscar's belly. The Swordmaster ensured the deed was done, that Oscar would die. It was April 28th, 3:12 p.m., when the last dragon in existence and the observer of history, Edna Saul Laplace, appeared before Oscar. She reported on the war, confirming that the High Priest had indeed been killed. She had both bad and good news. Oscar, weak but curious, asked to hear the bad news first. Edna told him that though most of the White Tower mages had perished, the Imperial army had arrived earlier than expected. Because of this, a few had been saved, including his disciples. Oscar sighed with relief and requested that Edna look after them. She promised she would and, in an act that struck him deeply, bowed to him. It was rare, yet Edna told him he deserved it for all he had done for humanity and the continent. He died not with regret, but with the quiet realization that he had always strived to be a great mage, not a great leader. If given another life, he would live selfishly, but for others. With a jolt, a 20-year-old young man awoke from a deep sleep, startling the person near him and causing water and towels to spill onto him. As the young man fussed over the wet shirt, everything around him felt disorienting. But then, memories came flooding back. The war, the High Priest, his death. His heart pounded. That shouldn't have been possible. He should have been dead. At that moment, Elder Maxim burst into the room, asking if he was finally awake. Oscar Sage, now inhabiting this young man's body, found the entire situation absurd. He asked why he was still alive. Elder Maxim, barely restraining his rage, only calmed by Frank holding him back, replied with biting sarcasm. After embezzling research fees and buying illegal elixirs, it was shocking to see him alive. Oscar noticed the Elder's White Tower uniform and asked him to explain himself, his tone laced with superiority. This only further provoked the Elder, who lunged to strike him. But Oscar, with a flicker of magic, raised a windshield. Though weak, it was enough to halt the blow, and enough to impress. The Elder backed down, saying he would delay reporting the embezzlement. Then he left. Afterwards, Frank remarked that Oscar had been acting strangely. It was reckless to provoke someone like Elder Maxim. But Oscar didn't respond. He was too shaken by the realization of how drastically his mana levels had dropped. He asked the date. Frank told him it was September 21st. Oscar gasped. He thought he had been asleep for 5 months. But Frank, puzzled, clarified that only a day had passed. He muttered to himself that Oscar must have lost his memory. Oscar then inquired about his disciples. Frank informed him that 2 had become traitors, and Sasha was now the White Tower Sage Master. That shocked him. How could a 5-year disciple hold such a title? As he approached Frank, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. The face staring back wasn't his. Horror dawned upon him. This was not his body. He had been reincarnated. Later, piecing together what he could about the true owner of the body, Oscar looked out the window and saw cars and streetlights, undeniable signs of the Magic Revolution era, as he had been awake after 20 years of his dead. He forced himself to focus. The body he now inhabited belonged to Oscar Crucian, a young man from a fallen noble family. At age 10, his family mansion was burned down, and he came to White Tower. Now 20, he was only a level 1 mage. In desperation, he had taken a cheap elixir, which became the cause of his death. But something didn't sit right. A strange substance trickled from his fingertip. It was a poison. The elixir had been laced. So, Oscar Crucian had been murdered. As raw mana surged faintly around him, Oscar Sage realized the elixir wasn't a complete hoax. Someone had played with his soul. but he had promised himself to live selfishly for others. For lending him this body, he vowed to avenge Oscar Crucian's death. On the outskirts of Siren, a man was stunned after hearing about the wreckage of his store. But the true shock came when he heard the name of the person responsible. It was Oscar Crucian. It seemed impossible. The boy had been on the verge of death. When someone mentioned that the White Tower had launched an investigation, the man scoffed. He dismissed the idea outright, stating that the elixir had been given to them by someone wearing a White Tower mage's robes. Just then, Oscar stepped into the room. He told them to continue their discussion as he, too, wanted to know who wanted him dead. Enraged at Oscar's appearance, the man barked an order to his subordinate to kill him. But before the attacker could get close, Oscar cast Wind Cutter. In an instant, the subordinate's head hit the ground. Shocked and panicking, the man pulled out a pistol and opened fire. Oscar didn't fully understand the concept of bullets, but he instinctively cast Windshield, deflecting the bullets back at the shooter. Now wounded and lying on the floor, the man tried to crawl away. Oscar knelt beside him, demanding to know who had ordered the elixir to be given. The man refused to speak. Without hesitation, Oscar cast a pain spell, one that mimicked the agony of 1,000 needles piercing the flesh. Screaming and writhing, the man begged for mercy, promising to tell everything. He confessed that the elixir had indeed been handed to them by a man dressed as a White Tower mage. But Oscar wasn't fooled. He knew it was just a ruse. Still, there was one thing the man remembered clearly about the mysterious figure. He carried a refreshing, mint-like scent. Oscar pressed further. Was he not afraid of the consequences? Of being caught for attempting to kill someone associated with the tower? The man laughed weakly. The White Tower, he explained, was too busy withdrawing from the magic towers to pay attention. Oscar was startled. He demanded to know more. The man admitted he didn't have the full picture but could provide documents that might help. Oscar took them and read. The contents chilled him. Following his death, the day of the High Priest's defeat had been commemorated as White Night. The White Tower, in tribute to his sacrifices, had been showered with benefits, among them, a 30-year tax exemption. However, in the most recent year, the tower had failed to produce anything noteworthy. If they failed again, they would be expelled from the Magic Tower system entirely. Not only that, they had been publicly declared the worst-performing tower in business contributions. Oscar asked what kinds of ventures the towers were now handling. The man explained. The Yellow Tower had ushered in the engineering era with innovations like street lamps and automobiles. The Blue Tower had monopolized the market on drinking water, agriculture, and potions. The Red Tower was thriving through military contracts, and the White Tower, they were handling delivery jobs, menial tasks carried out on windriders, humiliating work for once proud mages. Even worse, it was Oscar's own disciple, Sasha, the current White Tower master, who had signed off on this. Oscar was appalled. Why was the Blue Tower in charge of potions? That had always been the White Tower's domain. The man, still bleeding out, told him it was due to the Blue Tower's monopoly over clean water. Oscar couldn't believe the absurdity of it. As the man begged for help, Oscar noticed documents nearby, evidence of fraud and embezzlement. Without a word, Oscar turned and left him to die. Back at the White Tower, Oscar felt the toll of using magic in his weakened state. He was exhausted, and it concerned him. Wanting to understand the current condition of his new body, he initiated a magical scan. While it ran, he delved deeper into the life of the man whose body he now inhabited. Oscar Crucian had once been regarded as a child of great promise. Many had sought to recruit him, seeing in him the potential to rise from tragedy. During his 6 years at the Royal Academy, he showed academic excellence, top grades, and a thesis hailed as extraordinary. Yet, he achieved no notable magical feats. The reason was a diagnosis of mana deficiency syndrome. But as Oscar Sage reflected, something didn't add up. With his knowledge of magical anatomy, he realized mana deficiency syndrome should have been nearly impossible in someone with Crucian's background. There was only one explanation. Someone had deliberately sealed his mana circuit, which scan had proved so as well. After discovering that Oscar Crucian's mana circuits had been sealed, Oscar Sage grew increasingly curious about the young man whose body he now inhabited. All he knew was that Oscar Crucian was widely known as a drunkard, but perhaps that had only been a facade, a mask worn by someone who knew he was being hunted. Hoping to learn more, Oscar began searching for a diary. Instead, he came across a shelf filled with books about the understanding of magic, particularly the reinterpretation of basic magic, a topic heavily annotated and highlighted. He sat down and began reading. What he found stunned him. Oscar Crucian had been deeply immersed in magical theory and had even developed several basic spells on his own. His intellect and dedication lived up to the title of genius. In the epigraph of one of the books, Oscar Sage saw clarity. The young man had known what he was pursuing, but his path had been cruelly cut short by poison. Feeling both admiration and guilt, Oscar Sage vowed to honor Crucian's devotion. For the sake of that hard work, he would untie the sealed circuits and take vengeance on those who had clipped his wings. Without hesitation, he began meditating to undo the seal. Moments later, he found himself in a dreamlike garden. At first, he was confused, but quickly realized exhaustion had caused him to fall asleep mid-meditation. The dream confirmed something he had feared. The curse placed upon him by the Viscount of Nightmares from the demon world still lingered. It was tied to his soul, not his body, and would continue to haunt him as a reminder of his past life. In the dream, he saw his past self with his 3 disciples, teaching them about the different categories of magic, each one associated with a specific tower. They were curious to know which category they belonged to. Sasha, like himself, turned out to be of the balance type, unique to the White Tower. Gilead was an accelerator, and Lloyd was revealed to be a special type. When Lloyd expressed a desire to change his category, Oscar Sage had promised him extra lessons and to investigate the possibility, knowing how unusual such a power was. Just as the dream continued, a loud buzzer jolted him awake. It was a summon to room 4202. He remembered that he had managed to untie 12 of the 20 knots. Upon entering the room, Elder Maxim asked about his health and mentioned he'd heard rumors of his returning memories. Oscar confirmed it. Maxim expressed relief, then brought up a serious matter: the murder of the Gordon family's head. Oscar laid down the ledger he'd found at the scene and recounted the event, explaining that he'd acted in self-defense as they were planning to kill him. After a pause, Maxim nodded, saying he would classify it as such. Oscar then requested a meeting with the current Mage Master, only to be told she was away on a 6-month mission. The news alarmed him, as only 6 months remained until the White Night, and they had to prove the White Tower's worth by then. When he hesitantly asked about her magic level, Maxim told him it was level 7. He complimented Oscar's own recent rise in magical power, and then told him to leave. Not long after, Hamel Glimwitz, Vice Master of the White Tower, entered. He had come to request that Maxim go easy on Oscar. Hamel, too, commented on Oscar's improved magical ability, hinting that he must have been training in secret. Later, Oscar went up to the 10th floor, the same place he'd seen in his dream where he once taught his disciples. A man greeted him. Oscar didn't recognize him at first, but upon asking, the man introduced himself as Wilter, the manager of the tower's facilities. He remarked that they used to have small conversations. Oscar tried to continue the talk, but Wilter told him he was leaving the tower soon. The next day would mark 40 years of his service, and with the White Tower in financial decline, he could no longer remain. When Oscar mentioned the promised reward Wilter should receive after 40 years, Wilter smiled sadly. The tower couldn't afford it, but he had accepted that, calling the tower his second home. Reflecting on this, Oscar Sage realized that in his former life, he had chased after titles but never focused on wealth. Now, he made a silent vow to build wealth, restore the tower's glory, and ensure Wilter received the reward he had earned. Oscar Sage, even after making all those promises, stood at the edge of uncertainty. He didn't yet know how to bring them to life. So, he began reviewing old magazines and journals, desperate for a spark. And then, an idea struck him, one so sudden and clear that it reignited the fire within him. Energized, he raced off to present it to the higher-ups. In the Vice Tower Master's office, a heated debate was underway between Fidenlina, the White Tower's elder in charge of finances, and Elder Maxim. The topic of contention was Oscar Crucian. Maxim, more forgiving, believed Oscar was reflecting sincerely on his mistakes and deserved another chance. Fidenlina, however, wanted harsh punishment and insisted on his isolation training. Watching the two elders quarrel like bickering children, the Vice Tower Master finally interrupted and proposed a compromise. Instead of isolation, Oscar should pay back 3 times the amount he had embezzled. Fidenlina, still fuming, tried to argue, but the Vice Master firmly asked her to move on to the next agenda item. Their discussion turned to the tower's worsening financial state. Fidenlina suggested selling unused potion formulation lab equipment, reasoning that the money could keep them afloat for 3 months. The Vice Tower Master rejected the idea with finality, refusing to trade the future of the next generation for momentary relief. It was at that tense moment that someone barged into the room. It was Oscar. Fidenlina immediately snapped, questioning what business he had there. But without responding to her, he walked directly to the Vice Tower Master and declared that he had a solution to their crisis. Though Fidenlina protested his presence, the Vice Master allowed him to speak. Oscar explained that while reviewing old newspapers, he came across news about a lockdown in Vince State. That, he argued, could only mean one thing: the re-emergence of the Cadena flu, a dangerous illness for which a vaccine hadn't been found in over 20 years. The original recipe had been lost during the war, but Oscar was confident he could recreate it. The Vice Tower Master, skeptical but intrigued, asked him how he was so sure it was the Cadena flu. Oscar laid out his reasoning. The Archbishop of El Terra's order had altered his pilgrimage route, spending weeks in minor states and avoiding Vince. This pattern was highly unusual, as archbishops typically stayed only in major states. Oscar concluded that the archbishop must already be aware of the outbreak. Fidenlina, though begrudgingly acknowledging the possibility, questioned how Oscar planned to create the potion. With quiet pride, he replied, "Because I'm a genius." Despite Oscar's bold claim, the Vice Tower Master reminded him of the harsh reality. They lacked the funds for such an ambitious experiment. But after a pause, the Vice Master surprised them all by offering to personally finance the project. He handed Oscar 30,000 bells and asked if that would suffice. Though the amount was far from enough, Oscar, understanding the weight of the opportunity, accepted it without hesitation. Later, in the potion-making lab, Oscar was hit by the brutal reality of his limited resources. Creating a vaccine with such a tight budget was daunting. But then another idea struck him. He would craft a small sample of the vaccine and sell it directly to the Archbishop. After all, it was the Archbishop's credibility and position that were at stake. A failure during a pilgrimage could bring his career to ruin. With that, Oscar rolled up his sleeves and set to work, determination burning brighter than any doubt. Oscar Sage had first formulated an energy drink to test whether his memory truly held the forgotten recipes. But the moment he succeeded, he realized he had been worrying over nothing. His instincts and knowledge remained intact. Just then, Sirius Frank walked in, burdened with 3 hefty sacks of herbs, groaning about how utterly exhausted he felt. Spotting the drink on the table, he asked if Oscar had something to lift his spirits. Without hesitation, Oscar handed over the energy drink he'd just prepared. Sirius hesitated, thinking it might be expensive, but Oscar reassured him it was free. After one gulp, Sirius's weariness began to melt away. His surprise at the sudden burst of vitality showed just how potent Oscar's concoction truly was. Wasting no time, Oscar then moved on to begin crafting the actual potion. As he worked, he explained the process to Sirius in meticulous detail. The first step was detoxifying the herbs, not through boiling, as Sirius suggested, but by steaming them. Boiling, Oscar pointed out, would cause the nutrients to evaporate along with the toxic components. With steaming, however, the essence could be preserved. Using an air drain spell, he separated the toxic vapors, leaving behind only purified steam. This detoxified vapor was then condensed and mixed, completing the final stage of potion creation. Oscar's confident, seamless execution left Sirius awestruck. Oscar then asked Sirius to try the process himself. Yet when it came to casting the necessary double spells, he hesitated. He was only a level 3 mage and lacked the skill. When Sirius admitted his limitations, Oscar did something unexpected. He offered to teach him. Sirius was stunned, as senior mages never trained those below them. But Oscar, reading his expression, dismissed the norm. "That's greed," he said. "In war, these ranks mean nothing. Survival demands we share every technique we know." With that spirit, he taught Sirius how to manage dual spellcasting. To his own surprise, Sirius picked it up faster than expected. Working together, they toiled through the night, making batch after batch until they had produced 514 bottles in total. Exhausted but fulfilled, Sirius was just catching his breath when Elder Maxim burst into the lab. His face was grim. He informed them that Newtech, the pharmaceutical partner of the Azure Tower, had confirmed their visit with the Archbishop an hour earlier. That meant they were late. The contract was likely already lost, and all their effort might have been for nothing. The news brought tears to Sirius's eyes. But before despair could settle in, a new idea struck Oscar like lightning. He quickly shared it with Maxim and asked, "Isn't his flight speed faster than the wagons?" Meanwhile, at a lodging in Siren, Archbishop Baldwin was meeting with representatives from Azure Tower. Level 5, Mage Moira Main and Newtech's managing director, Neil Bryan, stood before him. They greeted them Archbishop with formal courtesy. He inquired about the vaccine's progress. They reported that the formula was nearly complete, but the clinical trials would take at least 6 more months. The Archbishop's expression soured. He had only 4 months left before his scheduled visit to Vince State, and delays were unacceptable. Just as they tried to explain the procedures in more detail, the Chamberlain interrupted with news of another mage's arrival. Moments later, Oscar Crushen stepped into the room. Calm and unwavering, he introduced himself as a level 2 mage from the White Tower and declared he was there to make the Archbishop a better offer. Cassian confidently told the Archbishop that he had a better offer. If negotiation was what they sought, they were prepared to discuss terms, as their vaccine was already ready for distribution. However, the representatives from Azure Tower doubted how the White Tower could have accomplished this without advanced technology and sufficient funding, given the tower's history. Oscar swiftly interrupted, remarking that if they were focusing on history, they should remember which tower had existed first. It was the White Tower. Moira Main, however, downplayed the significance of the 5-year gap. But he acknowledged the legacy of White Tower's monopoly over potions 2 decades ago. At that moment, the Archbishop received a call from Vince State. On the other end, Lord Vince expressed gratitude for the batch of vaccine he sent, which he prepared with the White Tower in secrecy. But when he inquired about the second batch's arrival, Elder Maxim told him to direct the question to Archbishop. The Archbishop confirmed they would send it soon and turned to Oscar, asking if this was his doing. Oscar affirmed it. Moira, not one to back down, raised a point. While the vaccine had been dispatched, he argued that the White Tower had violated the proper protocols, as the Drug Administration and Imperial Food Department had not granted approval. Given the time it would take for such approvals, Azure Tower would likely be able to produce their own vaccine in time, ready for mass production. When the Archbishop's confidence in the White Tower's vaccine began to falter, Oscar, unfazed, pointed out that it seemed Azure Tower mages were unaware of the rules. He explained that, during wartime, vaccines could be distributed without FDA approval. When asked how this could be a war, Oscar elaborated. There were 3 types of wars: one against another species, second when it's revolutions, and third triggered by disasters above B-level. The Kadena flu, he noted, naturally qualified as a disaster of that scale. He reminded them that, 22 years ago, the plague had killed countless people before a vaccine was approved, prompting the Empire to amend its rules for issuing vaccines during times of war. The Archbishop's patience snapped, and he ordered the Azure Tower representatives to leave. Neil Bryan, in a final act of defiance, offered to lower their price. But the Archbishop was resolute, insisting that his reputation wasn't for sale, and that he had already made it clear to Lord Vince that the White Tower had prepared the vaccine. In a fury, Moira stormed out, not before threatening Oscar that he would pay for this. As managing director Neil Bryan passed by Oscar, a distinct scent of mint lingered in the air, a smell that reminded him of the person who had ordered his assassination. Once they left, the Archbishop turned to Oscar, asking for the price of the potions, noting that Azure Tower had requested 2 million bells. Oscar, with a calculated calm, replied that if they wanted 2 million, he would be asking for 5 million. Back at the tower, Fidelina could hardly believe what she was holding in her hands. It was a check for 10 million bells. She embraced Oscar, praising him for his brilliance. Maxim joined in, congratulating him for proving what they had always known, that he could do it. Vice Master, still in disbelief, asked why the fee was set so high. Oscar, with a sly smile, explained that the additional cost included an advertisement fee, a detail that only added to the growing respect for his ingenuity.